Hello, I'm Ron Fox for getwoodworking.com, and I shall be looking at routers and the features that you should be looking for to get the best out of them. Right, let's see how we put our cutter in the router and set the depth of cut. I'm using a straight cutter as an example. The length of this cutter is about normal for 1/4 inch shanks. Makers make particularly long shank cutters for certain applications, but this is standard. And what we are told to do, and have been told for the last few years, is to insert the cutter shank about 3/4 of the length of its length into the collet. At the same time, we are told not to put it so far in that the bottom of the shank grounds on the bottom of the motor spindle. If you do, you'll get vibration down through the cutter and the cut won't be as good as it ought to be. Now, with this particular router and the others we shall be looking at, you can completely ignore this second requirement about being careful not to ground the cutter shank on the motor spindle, because the drilling in the motor spindle is so deep that can go all the way in. It still won't be touching the bottom of the motor spindle. But this doesn't apply to all routers, and with some of them with rather poorer quality collets, not only is the collet not of very good quality, but it's also very shallow, and so is the motor spindle, so you can't put your cutters in far enough. I've put this cutter about 3/4 of the shank length in. Now, it doesn't matter if you go a bit deeper, so long as you've got enough depth of cut, but you always want to leave some bright shank showing, because where you get near the actual cutter body, not only do you find paint or Teflon coating, but you sometimes find a kind of fillet of metal there. So that's in nicely. We now put the spanner on it. I'm going to turn it over because this is a single spanner job. There is a spindle lock there. Now we turn the cutter on the collet nut gently until the spindle lock engages. Now we've got our spindle held by the spindle lock, and we're tightening it up. And with a decent quality collet, what we'd look for is to tighten it firmly without using any white knuckle stuff. The better quality the collet, the less brute force you need to use to tighten it. So we've got our cutter in. We're now going to set the depth of cut. Now, to set the depth of cut with the straight cutter, first of all we plunge the cutter to the surface of the work. We then, if we're just making a single pass, we put the lowest position of the rotating turret underneath the stop bar. We do that for a bit of useful workshop practice, because if we set it on one of the higher positions, it's no more or less accurate, but we might conceivably rotate the turret before the job is finished, and then we would cut too deep and it would bound to be on your last piece of prime hardwood. So lowest position of the turret under the stop bar, bottom of the straight cutter resting on the workpiece. For a 6mm cut, we now have to create a gap of 6mm between the bottom of the stop rod and the top of the screw. It's not easy to use the scale and the line on here, and it's certainly not accurate, but fortunately we've got one or two very simple ways of doing this. And the simplest is to take our twist drills and use the shanks as feeler gauges. So if we want a 6mm deep cut, I've taken a 6mm twist drill. I've put it between the stop screw and the bottom of the stop rod, pressing it down. I tighten up the thumb screw on the stop rod. There. Now, that gap is now 6mm. Makes life a lot easier. Right, now to remove the cutter, we pick up our spanner, thumb ready on the spindle lock. We turn the collet gently until the spindle lock engages, and then we put the spanner on it and we loosen the nut. Now, having got that far, releasing the initial friction of the nut, you'll find you can turn that a little way and you think it's free, but then it tightens up again. And if you are not Superman, as most of us are not, you're going to need the spanner back on there to get that cutter out, because as it stands, although you've loosened it with your fingers, you can't get that cutter out. You will not get that cutter out until you've put the spanner on to take a second bite. And what you're doing then is winding the collet nut up the threads, and as soon as it comes loose the second time, you can take the cutter out. Now, this is a trick that has caused untold confusion over the years, because not all router handbooks tell you that you've got to use 2 bites of the spanner on this type of collet. And people have resorted to all sorts of things, usually involving something to do with a length of wood and a hammer, to get their cutters out, which doesn't do any part of the router or the cutter much good. And once you show them this, I've had a few people at shows and on courses who have smote their heads dismay at having struggled for years before they discovered this trick. But it's not necessarily their fault. If it's not in the handbook and you're a beginner to routing, how are you supposed to know? The fact is, with a straight cutter, this is what we do to put our cutter in, set the depth of cut and remove the cutter. The crucial thing is 2 bites of the spanner when you are removing the cutter. Only 1 when you're putting it in, but 2 when you're removing it.